When Rebecca Stone walked into the Fort Campbell commissary that Tuesday morning, wearing a faded army jacket that had seen better days, she had no idea that the next hour would transform her from a forgotten veteran into a living legend. The young officers who mocked her costume were about to learn that sometimes the most unassuming person in the room carries the heaviest secrets, and when a 4-star general suddenly snapped to attention and saluted her in front of everyone, their world would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Kentucky hills surrounding Fort Campbell as the military installation came alive with its daily rhythm. Soldiers jogged in formation along the perimeter roads, their cadence calls echoing across the sprawling base. Helicopters from the 101st Airborne Division lifted off in the distance, their rotors cutting through the crisp October air. American flags stood at attention on every flagpole, snapping proudly in the autumn breeze. Through this carefully orchestrated military ballet moved Rebecca Stone, a woman who seemed to exist in the spaces between worlds. At 52, she carried herself with a posture that spoke of military training, though her gait was slightly uneven, a subtle limp that she'd learned to disguise over the years. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her face bore the weathered look of someone who had seen more than most people could imagine. The jacket she wore told its own story. Once a deep olive green, it had faded to a muted sage color, with frayed cuffs and worn patches at the elbows. The fabric was soft from countless washings, and if you looked closely, you could see the ghost outlines where military patches had once been sewn, carefully removed long ago, leaving only faint marks that most people would never notice. Rebecca approached the commissary's automatic doors with the measured pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy. Her right leg ached more in the cold weather, a reminder of events that officially never happened in a desert halfway around the world. She shifted the worn canvas messenger bag on her shoulder. Inside it, a carefully folded grocery list written on the back of an envelope, a thin wallet with exactly $47 in cash, and a small photograph she never looked at, but always carried. Commissary doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, and Rebecca stepped into the fluorescent-lit world of military shopping. The place buzzed with activity, young military families navigating wide aisles with overflowing carts, retirees gathering around the coffee station to share stories of deployments past, and active duty personnel grabbing quick meals between duties. The familiar sounds of military life surrounded her, the crinkle of camouflage uniforms, conversations peppered with military jargon, and the occasional yes sir or no ma'am that marked the respectful culture of military communities. Rebecca picked up a red shopping basket and consulted her list. Every item had been chosen carefully, generic brands, sale items, the kind of practical shopping that came from living on a fixed income. Her VA disability check provided the basics, but extras were rare. The bureaucratic maze that had entangled her benefits claim for over 15 years had taught her to make every dollar stretch. She moved through the store methodically, comparing prices with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to find value in small things. In the canned goods section, she examined soup labels with careful attention, her fingers marked by an old scar across her knuckles, tracing over prices as she calculated the best deals. The scar had its own story, earned during a night when everything went wrong and staying alive meant making choices. No training manual could prepare you for that. As Rebecca reached for a can of tomato soup on a higher shelf, her jacket sleeve rode up slightly, revealing more of the scarring on her right wrist, surgical marks from procedures that had restored most of the function to her hand, though some movements still brought sharp reminders of that night in the Iraqi desert. She placed the can in her basket and moved toward the pasta aisle, unconsciously adjusting her jacket to cover the scars again. The commissary held no particular significance for Rebecca beyond its practical purpose. She shopped here twice a month, always during off-peak hours when the crowds were smaller and she could navigate the aisles without drawing attention. She had perfected the art of being invisible, moving through spaces without creating ripples, existing in the margins where no one looked too closely. But invisibility, she had learned, was a double-edged sword. It protected her from questions she couldn't answer about service that officially never happened. But it also meant that the sacrifices she had made, the friends she had lost, and the prices she continued to pay remained locked away and classified. Files and her own carefully guarded memories. As she selected a box of spaghetti, Rebecca's mind wandered briefly to the small apartment where she lived alone, about 15 minutes off base. The walls were mostly bare, except for a single framed photograph of 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, their faces partially obscured by tactical gear and shadows. To anyone else, it would look like a standard military unit photo. Only Rebecca knew that 4 of the 5 people in that picture were dead, and that the mission they had completed together had prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of civilians. She worked nights as a security guard at a medical facility, a job that kept her busy during the quiet hours when memories had a way of surfacing uninvited. The work was simple: monitor cameras, make rounds, file reports, but it provided purpose and a steady paycheck that supplemented her limited VA benefits. Her colleagues knew her as a reliable, quiet woman who never called in sick and always volunteered for holiday shifts. They had no idea that the unassuming guard checking their building's locks had once led a classified unit through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Middle East. The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca that she now spent her nights protecting a building full of people who slept peacefully, unaware that their safety had once depended on soldiers like her who operated in the shadows. But that was the nature of her former work. Success was measured not by recognition received, but by disasters prevented, attacks stopped before they began, and lives saved by people who would never know they had been in danger. As she made her way toward the checkout lanes, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of her hidden history. Every person she passed, every conversation she overheard, every mundane interaction reminded her of the gap between her public and private selves. She was a veteran, but her service couldn't be verified through normal channels. She was a hero, but her heroism was buried in files so classified that even she sometimes wondered if it had all been real. The checkout lines were busy with the mid-morning crowd, and Rebecca chose the shortest one, settling in behind a young sergeant buying energy drinks and breakfast sandwiches. She stood patiently, her grocery basket containing the simple necessities of a life lived quietly: soup, pasta, bread, milk, the basic building blocks of solitary meals and simple routines. She had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, her carefully constructed invisibility would be shattered forever. She couldn't know that destiny was about to walk through the same automatic doors she had just entered, wearing stars on his shoulders and carrying memories of a night in the Iraqi desert when a small team of American soldiers had saved his life and prevented a catastrophe that would have changed the course of history. For now, she was simply Rebecca Stone, a middle-aged woman in a faded jacket, shopping for groceries and planning another quiet day in a life that had taught her to expect nothing more than the basics. The photograph in her bag remained folded and hidden. The scars on her wrists stayed covered by her sleeves, and the stories that could fill books remained locked away in her heart. But sometimes, the universe has other plans. The checkout line moved with typical military efficiency, each customer processed with the practiced speed of commissary workers who had seen thousands of soldiers, families, and veterans pass through their lanes. Rebecca stood quietly behind the young sergeant, observing the familiar rhythm of military life around her. Conversations flowed in the distinctive cadence of Army personnel: updates about deployments, discussions of training schedules, complaints about paperwork, the eternal constants of military service. Behind her, she could hear 2 women discussing their husband's upcoming field exercise, their voices carrying the particular blend of pride and worry that military spouses knew well. To her left, an older veteran in a Vietnam War cap examined his receipt with careful attention, his weathered hands moving with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to account for every dollar. These were her people, Rebecca thought, even if they would never know it. The sergeant ahead of her completed his purchase and moved away, leaving Rebecca to face the cashier, Master Sergeant Frank Cooper, according to his name tag. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in service before transitioning to civilian employment at the commissary. His veteran's cap indicated he had served with the 82nd Airborne, and Rebecca noticed the small combat veteran pin that marked him as someone who had seen action overseas. "Morning, ma'am," Sergeant Cooper said as he began scanning her items. His voice carried the respectful tone that longtime military personnel used with everyone, regardless of their apparent status. It was a courtesy that Rebecca appreciated, more than he could know. "Good morning," she replied quietly, her voice slightly hoarse from disuse. She spoke so rarely during her daily routines that her vocal cords sometimes seemed surprised when called into service. As Cooper scanned her groceries, his eyes briefly took in her appearance, the faded jacket, the careful budget shopping, the worn canvas bag. But unlike many others, his expression showed no judgment, only the quiet respect that one veteran might show another, even without confirmation of shared service. "Will that be cash or card today?" he asked, noting the modest collection of generic brands and sale items. "Cash," Rebecca replied, pulling out her thin wallet and counting out bills with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how much money she had and where every dollar needed to go. The wallet itself told a story-worn leather that had once been black but had faded to brown, with credit card slots that held only her ID, a single debit card, and a folded paper with emergency contact information that listed no family members. Only a VA caseworker who returned calls sporadically. As she counted out the money, a small item fell from her wallet and landed on the counter between them. It was a challenge coin, not the standard variety sold in base gift shops, but something special. The metal was worn smooth in places from years of handling, and the design was subtle, almost unremarkable to casual observation. "But Sergeant," Cooper's eyes widened slightly as he recognized what it was. Rebecca quickly picked up the coin and tucked it back into her wallet, but not before Cooper had seen enough to understand that this unassuming woman carried something that marked her as far more than she appeared. Challenge coins of that particular design were not given lightly, and they certainly weren't available to civilians or standard military personnel. "Have a good day, ma'am," Cooper said, his tone unchanged but his eyes holding a new level of respect. He had questions, but military protocol and simple courtesy prevented him from asking them. "Thank you," Rebecca replied, accepting her receipt and gathering her bags. She could sense his curiosity, but appreciated his restraint. Over the years, she had encountered a few people who recognized signs that others missed, the way she carried herself, small items like the challenge coin, subtle indications that her story was more complex than it appeared. But those moments were rare, and they usually passed without comment. Rebecca made her way toward the exit, her grocery bags manageable, but requiring some adjustment due to the lingering limitations in her right shoulder. The physical therapy she had received through the VA had restored most of her range of motion, but certain movements still triggered sharp reminders of that night when everything went wrong. She had learned to adapt, to work around the limitations, to function normally despite the permanent changes to her body. As she walked through the commissary, Rebecca's mind drifted to the routine that awaited her at home. She would put away her groceries, prepare a simple lunch, and try to get some sleep before her night shift began at 6 o'clock. Sleep during the day was always challenging. The world was too bright, too noisy, too full of activities that reminded her of the life she might have had if things had been different. Her apartment was a small one-bedroom unit in a complex that catered to military personnel and veterans. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were quiet, and the management company didn't ask too many questions about employment history or references. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could live quietly without attracting attention or forming relationships that might lead to uncomfortable questions. The apartment's furnishings were sparse but functional, a second-hand couch that served as both seating and occasional bed when her injuries made climbing stairs difficult, a small dining table that doubled as a desk, a television that she rarely watched, and a bookshelf filled with paperback novels that provided escape from thoughts that sometimes demanded too much attention. The kitchen was adequate for simple meals, and the bedroom contained only a bed, a dresser, and the one photograph that connected her to her past. Rebecca's daily routine had been carefully constructed to minimize complications and maximize stability. She shopped for groceries twice a month, always at off-peak hours. She worked 4 nights a week, leaving 3 nights for rest and recovery. She attended a monthly appointment with Dr. Jennifer Adams, a VA psychologist who specialized in working with veterans whose service histories were complicated by classification issues. These sessions were among the few times Rebecca spoke openly about her experiences, though even there, certain details remained locked away. The drive home from the commissary took her through the quiet residential areas that surrounded Fort Campbell. She passed elementary schools where military children learned their lessons, community centers where families gathered for events and support, and small businesses that catered to the needs of military personnel and their families. This was the visible face of military life, the normal, everyday world that existed because people like Rebecca had once stood watch in darker places. Her car was a 15-year-old Honda Civic with reliable engine and worn seats, the kind of vehicle that drew no attention and required minimal maintenance. She had bought it with cash 3 years earlier, after her previous car had finally given up. The radio was tuned to a classical music station that played softly as she drove, providing a peaceful backdrop to her thoughts. As Rebecca turned into her apartment complex, she reflected on the strange duality of her existence. She lived in a world surrounded by military personnel and veterans, yet she remained essentially isolated from their community. She carried the invisible wounds and visible scars of military service, yet she couldn't access many of the support systems designed to help veterans because her service remained classified at levels that prevented normal verification. The irony was that she had served her country in ways that went far beyond what most people could imagine, but the very nature of that service made it impossible to claim the recognition or support that less classified veterans received automatically. She had saved lives, prevented disasters, and paid prices that continued to compound with interest, yet she remained invisible to the systems designed to help people exactly like her. But invisibility, Rebecca had learned, was both a burden and a protection. It meant loneliness, but it also meant safety. It meant isolation, but it also meant that the secrets she carried remained secure. It meant that her sacrifices went unrecognized, but it also meant that the mission came first, just as she had been trained. As she parked her car and gathered her groceries, Rebecca had no idea that her carefully maintained invisibility was about to be shattered forever. Rebecca had made it halfway to her car when she realized she had forgotten to pick up the prescription refill that Dr. Adams had called in for her. The medication helped manage the chronic pain in her shoulder and leg, enough to eliminate it completely, but sufficient to make her daily activities manageable. With a quiet sigh, she turned around and headed back toward the commissary, her grocery bags rustling softly as she adjusted her grip. The automatic doors slid open again, welcoming her back into the fluorescent-lit world she had just left. This time, however, the commissary seemed busier. A group of young officers had gathered near the entrance, their crisp uniforms and polished boots marking them as recent graduates from officer training programs. Their conversation carried the particular energy of military personnel, who were still young enough to believe that confidence and enthusiasm could overcome any obstacle. Rebecca made her way toward the pharmacy counter at the back of the store, moving with the same measured pace that had become her default setting. She passed the group of officers without making eye contact, her years of practiced invisibility serving her well. But as she walked by, one of them noticed her jacket. Lieutenant Tyler Brooks was 24 years old and had graduated from West Point 8 months earlier with the kind of academic excellence that had earned him respect from his instructors and envy from his classmates. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had never faced a challenge he couldn't overcome through intelligence, determination, and the advantages that came with his background. His family had a long tradition of military service, though none of them had ever served in combat roles. "Check out the vintage military fashion," Brooks murmured to his companion, Lieutenant Ashley Reed, as Rebecca passed within earshot. His voice carried just enough volume to be heard by those nearby, but was quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. Lieutenant Reed, a 23-year-old logistics officer who had been commissioned through ROTC at a prestigious university, glanced in Rebecca's direction and smiled. She was smart, ambitious, and had quickly learned that success in the military often depended as much on social dynamics as professional competence. Aligning herself with Brooks, who was clearly destined for rapid promotion, seemed like a strategic choice. "That jacket has definitely seen better days," Reed replied, her tone carrying the kind of casual dismissiveness that young professionals sometimes use to establish their superiority over those they perceived as inferior. "Probably picked it up at a thrift store." Rebecca continued toward the pharmacy, but she could hear their conversation continuing behind her. The words weren't directed at her specifically, but the target was clear enough. She had encountered this type of behavior before: young military personnel who made assumptions about older veterans based on appearances, particularly veterans whose circumstances suggested financial limitations or non-traditional military backgrounds, got at the pharmacy counter. Rebecca provided her information to the technician, a young corporal who processed her request with efficient professionalism. While she waited for the prescription to be filled, she could hear the group of officers moving through the store, their conversation continuing to drift in her direction. "I wonder what her story is supposed to be," Brooks was saying as they paused near the pharmacy area, ostensibly examining products on the shelves but clearly continuing their entertainment at Rebecca's expense. "Desert Storm? Afghanistan? Or maybe she just likes the military look. Hard to tell with some people," Reed added. "Could be anything. These days you never know who's authentic and who's just playing dress up." Rebecca's expression remained neutral, but her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times over the years: the casual questioning of veterans' authenticity, the assumption that anyone who didn't fit a particular image must be fabricating their military connection. The irony was particularly sharp, given that her authentic service was classified at levels that made verification impossible through normal channels. A third voice joined the conversation: Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a military intelligence officer who had recently completed specialized training in threat assessment and personnel evaluation. Webb was quieter than his colleagues, more observant, and had a habit of analyzing people and situations with the kind of systematic approach that his training had instilled. "Actually," Webb said, his voice thoughtful as he studied Rebecca more carefully, "there are a few things that seem genuine about her." Brooks turned to look at Webb with interest. "Like what?" "The way she carries herself, the posture, the situational awareness. And that jacket, it's not a reproduction. That's authentic issue, probably from the early 2000s based on the cut and fabric." Rebecca's prescription was ready, and she completed the transaction with the same quiet efficiency she brought to all her interactions. But as she turned to leave, She could hear the conversation continuing behind her. Even if the jacket is real, that doesn't mean it's hers, Reed pointed out. Could have belonged to a family member. Or she could have bought it from a surplus store. True, Webb acknowledged, but look at how she moves. That's not civilian movement patterns. That's someone with military training. Brooks laughed softly. You're reading too much into it, Webb. Lots of people can fake military bearing if they practice enough. Hell, there are YouTube videos that teach you how to walk like a soldier. As Rebecca made her way back toward the exit, the conversation followed her. The group of officers had apparently decided that analyzing her authenticity made for interesting entertainment, and they were no longer making any effort to keep their voices down. Other shoppers were beginning to notice the dynamic. Some casting curious glances between Rebecca and the young officers who were discussing her like a specimen in a laboratory. I bet she's heading to the VA next to try for benefits, Brooks said, his voice now loud enough that several nearby shoppers turned to look. That's usually how these stolen valor cases work. Get the costume, learn the terminology, and hope. Nobody asks the hard questions. Rebecca reached the exit, but found herself moving more slowly than usual. Each comment felt like a small weight added to the burden she already carried. She had endured this type of treatment before, but something about this particular encounter felt different. Maybe it was the public nature of the mockery, or the way other shoppers were beginning to stare, or simply the accumulation of years of similar encounters finally reaching a tipping point. For just a moment, she paused near the automatic doors, her hand moving unconsciously to the place on her jacket where a unit patch had once been sewn. The patch had been removed years ago for security reasons, but her fingers still remembered exactly where it had been positioned. In that patch had been symbols that would have immediately silenced any questions about her authenticity if she had been allowed to wear them. Behind her, the conversation continued with increasing boldness. Brooks and Reed had apparently decided that their audience appreciated their commentary, and they were now speaking openly about the problem of fake veterans and the importance of calling out people who tried to claim military status they hadn't earned. Someone should really say something, Reed was saying. I mean, it's disrespectful to actual veterans when people dress up and pretend to be something they're not. Rebecca could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her now. The situation had attracted attention from throughout the commissary, creating the kind of public spectacle that she had spent years trying to avoid. She stood at the threshold between the military world inside the commissary and the civilian world beyond the automatic doors, carrying secrets that could never be shared and defending a service record that officially didn't exist. What she didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, everything would change. A black SUV was approaching the commissary parking lot, carrying a passenger whose memories of a night in the Iraqi desert were about to collide with the present moment in ways that would transform both his life and hers forever. For now, though, she was simply a woman in a faded jacket, standing alone against assumptions and accusations that cut deeper than the people making them could possibly understand. The automatic doors remained closed as Rebecca stood motionless, neither moving forward into the parking lot nor turning back toward the commissary. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Behind her, the conversation had attracted even more attention, with several other young officers joining the group that had formed around Brooks and Reed. "Ma'am, are you all right?" asked a voice beside her. Rebecca turned to see a young specialist. With a concerned expression, his arms full of groceries and his manner respectful. The kindness in his voice was a sharp contrast to the commentary that continued behind them. "I'm fine, thank you," Rebecca replied quietly, managing a small smile. That didn't quite reach her eyes. The specialist nodded and continued on his way, but his brief moment of genuine courtesy reminded her that not everyone made assumptions about people they didn't understand. Rebecca finally stepped through the automatic doors, but instead of heading directly to her car, She found herself walking slowly along the sidewalk that ran parallel to the commissary's front windows. She told herself she was simply taking a moment to organize her thoughts, but truthfully, something about the encounter had triggered a stubbornness she hadn't felt in years. These young officers were discussing her service, her authenticity, her right to wear the jacket that carried more history than they could imagine. Part of her wanted to simply leave and let them enjoy their moment of superiority, but another part, the part that had once led soldiers through hostile territory, was tired of running from confrontations she hadn't started. Inside the commissary, the group around Brooks and Reed had grown to include 6 officers, along with several enlisted personnel who had been drawn in by the commotion. Brooks was clearly enjoying his role as the center of attention, and his commentary had become increasingly bold as his audience grew. "Look at her out there," he said, gesturing toward the window where Rebecca could be seen walking slowly along the sidewalk. "She knows we're talking about her, but she can't say anything because she knows we're right. If she had legitimate military credentials, she'd come back in here and prove it." Lieutenant Reed nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Real veterans don't skulk around when their service is questioned. They produce documentation, they tell their stories, they stand up for themselves." Her behavior is actually pretty typical for someone who's been caught in a lie. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a logistics NCO with 3 deployments under her belt, had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort. Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, though. She couldn't quite identify what was bothering her. She had encountered her share of fake veterans over the years, but she had also learned that military service came in many forms, and not all of them were immediately recognizable to others. "Maybe we should give her the benefit of the doubt," Santos suggested quietly. "We don't actually know anything about her background." Brooks turned to Santos with the kind of patronizing smile that young officers sometimes used when enlisted personnel offered opinions that contradicted their own. "Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your perspective, but this is pretty obviously a case of stolen valor. The signs are all there: the thrift store military surplus jacket, the inability to defend herself when questioned, the general appearance of someone who's trying to access benefits they haven't earned." "But what if she's legitimate?" Santos persisted. "What if there are reasons we don't understand for why she can't or won't discuss her service?" Lieutenant Webb, who had been observing the entire exchange with the analytical mindset that his intelligence training had developed, decided to take a more direct approach. "There's an easy way to settle this," he said. "Why don't we go out there and have a conversation with her? Ask some basic questions that any real veteran would be able to answer. If she's legitimate, she'd have no problem providing details about her service." The suggestion energized the group. Several of the officers began discussing what questions would be most effective in exposing a fake veteran: details about military training, deployment locations, unit structures, the kind of information that would be common knowledge to anyone who had actually served, but difficult for a civilian to fake convincingly. Outside, Rebecca had completed her slow circuit of the sidewalk and was now standing beside her car, her keys in her hand, but her attention focused on the activity visible through the commissary windows. She could see the group of officers engaged in animated discussion, occasionally gesturing in her direction. Their body language made it clear that they were planning something, and her years of tactical training told her that whatever they were planning would likely involve a direct confrontation. She could simply get in her car and drive away. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that would avoid complications and maintain the low profile that had served her well for so many years. But as she stood there, Rebecca found herself thinking about her fallen teammates, about the soldiers who had died believing that their service mattered, that their sacrifices meant something, that the mission was worth the price they had paid. Corporal Anthony Garcia had been 22 years old when he died covering their withdrawal from a compromised position in Iraq. He had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, had never questioned orders even when they meant almost certain death, had believed absolutely in the importance of their mission and the value of their service. Would he have walked away from this confrontation? Would he have let these young officers continue spreading their assumptions about veterans who didn't fit their narrow definition of authenticity? The answer, Rebecca knew, was no. Tony Garcia would have stood his ground, not out of pride or anger, but out of respect for everyone who had served in silence, everyone who had sacrificed without recognition, everyone who had paid prices that could never be fully understood by people who had never been tested in the same ways. Rebecca closed her car door and began walking back toward the commissary. Her decision wasn't driven by a need to prove anything to the officers inside, but by a responsibility to represent something larger than herself. She carried the memory of her fallen teammates, the knowledge of missions that had prevented disasters, the understanding that service sometimes meant accepting misunderstanding rather than demanding recognition. As she approached the automatic doors for the third time that morning, Rebecca could see the group of officers moving toward the exit. Their timing was perfect. They would intercept her just as she entered, creating the kind of public confrontation that would maximize their audience and her embarrassment. The specialist who had shown her kindness earlier was still visible near the checkout lines, along with Sergeant Cooper and dozens of other military personnel and family members who would witness whatever was about to unfold. The automatic doors slid open, and Rebecca stepped back into the commissary just as Brooks and his group reached the entrance. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the doorway, a middle-aged woman in a faded jacket, carrying grocery bags, and a group of young officers in crisp uniforms with polished brass and confident expressions. "Excuse me, ma'am," Brooks said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the entrance area. "We were wondering if we could ask you a few questions about your military service." The commissary fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, shopping carts paused in the aisles, and dozens of pairs of eyes focused on the confrontation that was about to unfold. Rebecca stood perfectly still, her expression calm but her mind calculating options and assessing threats with the kind of tactical awareness that never completely faded. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Your jacket," Reed said, stepping forward to stand beside Brooks. "It's military issue, and we were curious about your service history. Where did you serve? What was your most basic questions that any veteran would be happy to answer?" Rebecca looked at the faces surrounding her, young, confident, certain of their righteousness. They had no idea what they were asking, no understanding of the complexities that could make such simple questions impossible to answer. They saw a woman who appeared vulnerable and assumed she was fraudulent. They saw someone who couldn't defend herself and concluded she was lying. What they didn't see was the woman who had once coordinated a night extraction operation that saved 37 American lives, including a future general who was at that very moment driving toward the commissary for a routine shopping trip that would change everything. "I served," Rebecca said simply, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to resonate through the sudden silence of the commissary. But Brooks wasn't satisfied with simple answers. "When? Where? With what unit?" And Rebecca's stone holder of classified clearances that still carried legal weight 15 years after her service ended, looked into the faces of officers who would soon learn that some questions were more dangerous than the people asking them could possibly imagine. "That's classified," she said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Brooks' expression shifted from confident curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Around them, the commissary had become completely silent, with shoppers and employees alike sensing that they were witnessing something significant, though none could have predicted how significant it would prove to be. "Classified?" Brooks repeated, his voice carrying a tone of polite skepticism that was somehow more insulting than outright mockery. "Ma'am, with all due respect, If your service was classified, you'd have documentation to prove it. Even classified operations generate paperwork that can verify service without revealing operational details. Lieutenant Reed stepped closer, her expression shifting into what she probably thought was a helpful professional demeanor. "We're not trying to embarrass you," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We're just concerned about the increasing problem of stolen valor. It's become a real issue, and it's disrespectful to those of us who have actually served." Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest. That came whenever she encountered the bureaucratic catch-22 that had defined her post-service life. The classified nature of her operations with Task Force Nighthawk meant that standard military documentation either didn't exist or was buried so deep in classified files that even she couldn't access it without going through channels that could take months or years to navigate. "I understand your concern," Rebecca said carefully, her voice remaining steady despite the growing crowd of onlookers. "But some operations generate documentation that isn't accessible through normal military channels." Staff Sergeant Santos, who had been watching the exchange with growing unease, decided to intervene. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private," she suggested, glancing around at the dozens of people who were now openly staring at the confrontation. But Brooks was clearly enjoying the audience. His West Point training had included courses on leadership and public speaking, and he had learned that nothing established authority quite like being seen resolving problems decisively in front of subordinates and peers. "Actually, Staff Sergeant, I think this is exactly the kind of situation that benefits from transparency," Brooks said. "If this woman has legitimate military credentials, she should be able to provide some form of verification. If she can't, then she's wearing a uniform she has no right to wear, and that's something the entire military community should be aware of." Lieutenant Webb, whose intelligence background had taught him to ask probing questions, decided to press further. "Ma'am, you mentioned that your service was classified. Can you tell us what agency or command structure oversaw these classified operations? Even if the missions themselves are classified, the existence of the units that conducted them is usually a matter of public record." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca found herself in the impossible position that had defined much of her post-military life. Task Force Nighthawk had operated under what the military called special access programs, classification levels so high that the very existence of the unit was denied. The soldiers who served in such units often found themselves in exactly this situation when their service ended, possessing legitimate military credentials that couldn't be verified through any normal channels. The Unit 1 served with operated under special access protocols, Rebecca explained, knowing that the explanation would sound like evasion to people who had never encountered such classifications. "The existence of the unit itself is classified, which means I can't provide unit designations, command structures, or operational details without violating federal law." Brooks exchanged a glance with Reed, and both officers' expressions showed that they found Rebecca's explanation unconvincing. To young officers who had served in conventional units with clear documentation and public recognition, the idea of military service that left no verifiable trace seemed implausible. "Ma'am," Brooks said, his tone becoming more formal and official, "I'm going to need to see some form of identification that can verify your military status. If you can't provide that, I'm going to have to ask you to remove that jacket. Wearing military insignia or uniforms without authorization is a federal offense." The accusation sent a ripple of tension through the crowd. Several veterans in the commissary moved closer, their expressions showing a mix of curiosity and concern. Master Sergeant Cooper, who had noticed Rebecca's challenge coin earlier, found himself studying her more carefully, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the subtle indicators He had observed that suggested her military background was more complex than it appeared. Rebecca reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a military ID card that was clearly authentic, but showed an expiration date from over 15 years ago. She also produced a letter on Department of Defense letterhead that was signed by officials whose titles were mostly redacted, explaining that certain service records remained classified for national security purposes. Brooks examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to spot fraudulent credentials. The ID card was clearly genuine. The security features, the formatting, the official seals were all correct. But the letter, while official, was frustratingly vague about specific details of Rebecca's service. This letter doesn't actually verify any specific military service, Brooks pointed out, holding the document up so that nearby onlookers could see it. It just says that some records are classified. Anyone could obtain a letter like this by filing the right paperwork and claiming their service was classified. Lieutenant Webb took the letter and examined it more closely. His intelligence training had familiarized him with various types of military documentation, and he had to admit that the letter appeared genuine. The letterhead, the signatures, the official language all seemed consistent with authentic Department of Defense correspondence. The signatures appear genuine, Webb said quietly to Brooks, and the reference numbers match the format used for actual classified correspondence. But Brooks was not ready to concede the point. Reference numbers can be faked, he said, and genuine letterhead can be obtained through various means. The fact remains that this woman cannot provide any specific, verifiable information about her alleged military service. Rebecca listened to their analysis of her documentation with a mixture of frustration and resignation. She had been through this process dozens of times over the years, with VA administrators, with potential employers, with skeptical officials, who couldn't understand how someone could have served their country without leaving a clear paper trail. I can provide a phone number for a Department of Defense liaison who can confirm my service status, Rebecca offered. Though they can only verify that I served, not the details of what I did. Anyone can provide a phone number, Reed said dismissively. And government liaisons are trained to protect classified information, which means they'll often confirm service status even when they shouldn't, just to avoid potential security breaches. The circle of onlookers had grown larger, and Rebecca could see a mix of expressions on the faces around her. Some people seemed sympathetic to her situation, while others appeared to agree with the young officer's skepticism. A few older veterans in the crowd looked uncomfortable with the entire confrontation, as if they understood that military service could be more complicated than it appeared on the surface. Sergeant Cooper finally decided to speak up. "Excuse me, sirs," he said, addressing Brooks and Reed with the respectful tone that enlisted personnel used with officers, even when they disagreed with them. "I've been working with veterans for over 20 years, and I've seen legitimate cases where service records are classified or incomplete. Maybe we should give this lady the benefit of the doubt." Brooks turned to Cooper with the kind of patient expression that young officers sometimes used when enlisted personnel offered opinions that contradicted their judgment. "Sergeant, I appreciate your experience, but we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of military service. If we don't challenge questionable claims, we encourage more people to make false claims about their service." "But what if she's telling the truth?" Cooper persisted. "What if she really did serve in classified operations that can't be verified through normal channels?" "Then she should understand why we have to be skeptical," Reed replied. "Real veterans don't get offended when their service is questioned. They understand that verification is important." Rebecca stood quietly through this exchange, holding her documents and watching the faces of the people around her. She had learned long ago that arguing with skeptics rarely changed their minds, and that defending herself often made her seem more suspicious rather than less. But she also understood that this confrontation had moved beyond questions about her individual service to larger questions about how military communities treated veterans whose experiences didn't fit conventional patterns. The situation had reached an impasse. Brooks and Reed remained convinced that Rebecca was attempting to deceive them, while Rebecca possessed genuine credentials that she couldn't fully validate due to their classified nature. The crowd continued to grow as word of the confrontation spread through the commissary, and the tension in the air was becoming almost palpable. What none of them knew was that resolution was approaching in the form of a black government SUV that was at that moment pulling into the commissary parking lot, carrying a passenger whose memories of a night in the Iraqi desert were about to collide with the present moment in ways that would change everything. The black SUV moved through the commissary parking lot with the purposeful efficiency of an official military vehicle. Its windows were tinted dark enough to obscure the occupants, and the small flags mounted on the front bumper indicated the presence of a high-ranking official. The vehicle's arrival went unnoticed by the crowd gathered inside the commissary, their attention completely focused on the confrontation between Rebecca and the young officers who continued to question her credentials. Inside the SUV, General William Hayes sat in the passenger seat, reviewing a briefing folder that contained updates on training programs and personnel assignments. At 58, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 3 decades of military service, including multiple combat deployments and steady progression through increasingly responsible command positions. His silver hair was cropped short in regulation style, and his dress blue uniform displayed the ribbons and decorations of a distinguished career that had taken him from second lieutenant to 4-star general. General Hayes had not planned to stop at the commissary that morning. His schedule called for a direct route from the airport to his office, where he was expected for a briefing on the latest developments in military training protocols. But his aide, Colonel Diana Walsh, had reminded him that his wife had specifically requested that he pick up a few items that were only available at the commissary, and his 40-year marriage had taught him that some requests from his wife took precedence over military schedules. "Sir, would you like me to wait in the vehicle?" asked Colonel Walsh as the SUV came to a stop near the commissary entrance. "No need, Colonel," General Hayes replied, closing his briefing folder and adjusting his uniform jacket. "This should only take a few minutes. Besides, it's been a while since I've had a chance to visit with the troops in an informal setting." As they stepped out of the SUV, General Hayes automatically scanned the area around the commissary with the kind of situational awareness that had become second nature during his years of service. He noticed the unusually large crowd visible through the front windows, and his experienced eye picked up on the body language that suggested some kind of confrontation or unusual situation was taking place inside. "Looks like something's going on in there," Colonel Walsh observed, following the general's gaze toward the commissary entrance. "Indeed," General Hayes replied. "Shall we see what has everyone's attention?" Inside the commissary, the confrontation between Rebecca and the young officers had attracted an even larger crowd. Brooks had positioned himself directly in front of Rebecca, his posture aggressive and his voice carrying clearly throughout the entrance area as he continued his interrogation. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to provide specific details about your alleged military service," Brooks was saying. "Unit designation, deployment locations, commanding officers, dates of service. These are basic details that any legitimate veteran would be able to provide without hesitation." Rebecca stood quietly, her expression calm but her internal tension increasing with each passing moment. She had been in hostile situations before, situations where saying the wrong thing could mean the difference between life and death, but this felt different. This was her own military community turning against her, questioning not just her credentials, but her right to exist in the space they all shared. "I've explained that the details of my service are classified," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. I've provided the documentation that I'm authorized to carry. I understand your skepticism, but I can't violate federal law by discussing classified operations. Lieutenant Reed stepped forward, her expression showing a mixture of frustration and what she probably thought was professional concern. Ma'am, claiming that your service is classified isn't a magic shield that protects you from legitimate questions. Even classified operations leave paper trails that can be verified through appropriate channels. The automatic doors slid open with their familiar mechanical whisper, and General Hayes entered the commissary followed by Colonel Walsh. The general's presence was immediately noticeable: his height, his bearing, the 4 stars on his shoulders, and the unmistakable aura of command authority that came with his rank. Conversations throughout the commissary began to die down as military personnel noticed the unexpected arrival of such a high-ranking officer. But General Hayes' attention was focused entirely on the scene playing out near the entrance. His eyes took in the confrontation between the young officers and the middle-aged woman in the faded jacket. And something about the woman's posture triggered a memory that had been buried for 15 years. He stopped walking, his expression changing from casual interest to intense focus as he studied Rebecca more carefully. The jacket she wore was familiar, not just the style, but something about the specific wear patterns, the fading, the way it hung on her shoulders. And her face, partially turned away from him as she faced her interrogators, carried features that seemed to echo across the years from a night when everything had gone wrong, and a small team of American soldiers had saved his life. Colonel Walsh noticed that the general had stopped moving. "Sir, is everything all right?" General Hayes didn't answer immediately. His mind was working through memories that he had carried for 15 years, comparing the woman before him with the face he remembered from a briefing photograph that had been classified so highly that even he had been allowed only a brief glimpse. The mission had been designated Operation Desert Shield, and it had involved a small team of specialists who had extracted him and his diplomatic security detail from what should have been a routine intelligence-gathering mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. The woman in the faded jacket turned slightly, and General Hayes caught a clearer view of her profile. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. Captain Rebecca Stone, Task Force Nighthawk, the woman who had led the team that saved 37 American lives, including his own, during one of the darkest nights of his military career. "Stone," he said quietly, the name carrying across the sudden silence of the commissary like a gunshot. Rebecca's head snapped around at the sound of her name, her eyes widening as she saw the 4-star general standing 20 feet away. For a moment, time seemed suspended as 15 years collapsed into a single instant of recognition. She saw not the general he had become, but the young colonel she had extracted from an impossible situation in the Iraqi desert, wounded and barely conscious but alive because her team had refused to leave anyone behind. Brooks and Reed followed Rebecca's gaze and suddenly realized that their interrogation had attracted the attention of one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. Their expressions shifted from confident aggression to barely concealed panic as they recognized that whatever was happening was far above their pay grade. Hayes began walking toward Rebecca with deliberate steps, his expression grave and his bearing formal. The crowd parted before him like water, military personnel automatically creating a clear path for the approaching general. The commissary fell completely silent, except for the soft sound of his polished shoes on the tile floor. When he reached a position directly in front of Rebecca, General Hayes stopped and stood at attention. Then, with the precision that came from decades of military ceremony, he raised his right hand to his forehead in a perfect salute, a gesture that sent shockwaves through every person in the commissary. Brooks and Reed stood frozen, their faces draining of color as they realized that the woman they had been accusing of stolen valor was being saluted by a 4-star general. Around them, other military personnel began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. something that would be talked about for years to come. Rebecca looked into General Hayes' eyes and saw the same recognition that she felt. Without hesitation, she transferred her grocery bags to her left hand and returned the salute with the same military precision she had learned 20 years ago, her movements transforming from the careful motions of a middle-aged civilian to the crisp certainty of a soldier. "Captain Stone," General Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the silent commissary. "Task Force Nighthawk, Operation Desert Shield." The words fell like hammer blows on the assembled crowd, confirming what many had already begun to suspect, that the woman they had been watching endure public humiliation was, in fact, exactly who she claimed to be. The salute seemed to stretch across eternity, two soldiers separated by 15 years and a vast difference in rank, united by memories of a night when survival had depended on trust, courage, and sacrifice. When General Hayes finally lowered his hand, the spell was broken. But the silence in the commissary continued as everyone waited to understand what they had just witnessed. "At ease, Captain," General Hayes said, though Rebecca held no current rank. The words were spoken with the kind of respect that transcended military protocol, acknowledging not just her past service, but the price she had paid for it. "Thank you, sir," Rebecca replied, her voice stronger now than it had been all morning. For the first time in 15 years, she was standing in front of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. Brooks and Reed remained frozen in place. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated. They had gone from interrogating what they thought was a fraud to watching a 4-star general salute the same woman they had been publicly humiliating. The implications of their behavior were beginning to dawn on them with the force of a freight train. General Hayes turned his attention to the crowd that had gathered around them, his eyes taking in the faces of the young officers who had been leading the confrontation. His expression was grave but controlled, the look of a senior commander who had just discovered a serious problem that needed immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with his rank but also the weight of personal experience. "You have just witnessed something that should never have been necessary. Captain Stone is one of the most decorated soldiers I have ever had the privilege to serve alongside, and she has just been subjected to treatment that is completely unacceptable." The general paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. 15 years ago, Captain Stone led a 6-person team that saved 37 American lives during a classified operation in Iraq. The mission was designated Operation Desert Shield, and it involved the extraction of a diplomatic team that had been compromised by enemy forces. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as people realized they were getting details about a classified military operation that had apparently never been made public. General Hayes continued, his voice growing more intense as the memories became more vivid. "The operation began as a routine intelligence-gathering mission," he explained. "I was serving as a colonel at the time, leading a small diplomatic security team that was meeting with local sources about terrorist activities in the region. What we didn't know was that our position had been compromised, and Iranian-backed militias had surrounded our safe house with the intention of capturing American personnel for propaganda purposes." Rebecca listened to the general's account with a mixture of professional interest and emotional intensity. She had lived through these events, but hearing them described from his perspective provided context that she had never fully understood at the time. "Our communications were jammed, our extraction routes were blocked, and we had enemy forces closing in from 3 directions," General Hayes continued. "Standard protocol called for us to destroy sensitive materials and attempt to evade capture. But we had wounded personnel who couldn't be moved quickly, and the enemy had thermal imaging equipment that made hiding nearly impossible." The crowd was completely captivated now, hanging on every word of a story that sounded like something from a military thriller, but was being told by one of the most senior officers in the United States Army. "That's when Task Force Nighthawk arrived," the general said, his eyes finding Rebecca's face in the crowd. 6 soldiers in 2 vehicles, operating under radio silence because they couldn't risk compromising their approach. They had been monitoring our situation through satellite intelligence, and they had developed an extraction plan that was so dangerous that any reasonable person would have called it suicide. Lieutenant Webb, whose intelligence background gave him some understanding of special operations, found himself leaning forward with intense interest. The scenario the general was describing involved the kind of tactical complexity that required years of specialized training and experience. Captain Stone's team created a diversion by attacking the enemy's command post, drawing their forces away from our position long enough for us to move to a secondary extraction point, General Hayes explained. But the plan required her team to hold a defensive position against overwhelming odds while we moved the wounded personnel to safety. The general's voice grew quieter, but his words carried even more impact in the sudden silence. 3 members of Captain Stone's team died that night, holding the line so that 37 Americans could come home alive. Corporal Anthony Garcia, Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, and Staff Sergeant Jennifer Kim gave their lives to complete a mission that prevented a diplomatic catastrophe and saved dozens of military and civilian personnel. Rebecca felt tears threatening to spill over as she heard the names of her fallen teammates spoken aloud for the first time in years. Garcia, Torres, and Kim had been more than soldiers. They had been friends, mentors, and brothers and sisters in arms who had trusted her leadership even when it led them into impossible situations. The operation was classified at the highest levels because acknowledging it would have revealed intelligence sources and methods that were critical to ongoing operations. General Hayes continued. The families of the fallen were told that their loved ones died in training accidents, and the survivors were reassigned to positions where their specialized skills could continue to serve their country. Brooks finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, we didn't know." General Hayes cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "Lieutenant, you didn't know because you didn't bother to find out. You made assumptions based on appearances, and you allowed those assumptions to guide your treatment of a veteran who has sacrificed more for this country than you can possibly imagine." The general turned back to Rebecca, his expression softening slightly. "Captain, I want to apologize on behalf of the United States Army for the treatment you have received today. It is completely unacceptable, and it will not happen again." "Sir, that's not necessary," Rebecca began, but General Hayes held up a hand to stop her. "It is absolutely necessary," he said firmly. "You and your team saved my life and the lives of 36 other Americans. You have been living with injuries sustained during that operation, and you have been fighting for recognition and benefits that should have been provided automatically. That ends today." The general reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, dialing with quick, decisive movements. "This is General Hayes," he said when the call was answered. "I need immediate action on a personnel matter involving classified service records." As the general spoke on the phone, arranging for Rebecca's service records to be partially declassified and her benefits to be expedited, the crowd around them began to process what they had just learned. The woman they had watched being humiliated was not just a veteran. She was a hero whose service had been hidden from public view for 15 years. Staff Sergeant Santos approached Rebecca with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I am so sorry for what happened here today. Thank you for your service. And thank you for your sacrifice." Similar acknowledgments began coming from throughout the crowd as military personnel realized that they had just witnessed a revelation of a story that would be told and retold for generations. But for Rebecca, standing in the commissary where her day had begun so differently, the most important moment was yet to come. The conversation she was about to have with the general who remembered exactly what her team had accomplished on one impossible night in the Iraqi desert. General Hayes ended his phone call and returned his attention to the crowd that had gathered around them. The commissary had become completely silent, except for the distant hum of refrigeration units and the occasional rustle of someone shifting uncomfortably. The weight of what had just been revealed hung in the air like a physical presence, and everyone seemed to understand that they had witnessed something that would change how they thought about service, sacrifice, and the assumptions they made about the people around them. "Lieutenant Brooks, Lieutenant Reed," General Hayes said, his voice carrying the kind of formal authority that made it clear this was not a request. "Please step forward." The two young officers approached with obvious reluctance, their faces pale and their movements uncertain. The confidence that had characterized their behavior just minutes earlier had been completely replaced by the kind of fear that came with realizing that their careers might be over before they had really begun. "Sir," Brooks said, his voice barely audible as he came to attention in front of the general. General Hayes studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and precise, the tone of a senior commander delivering a lesson that would not be forgotten. "Gentlemen, you have just provided a textbook example of how not to treat fellow service members," he said. "You made assumptions based on appearances. You questioned the integrity of a veteran without any evidence of wrongdoing, and you created a public spectacle that brought dishonor to the uniform you wear." Both lieutenants stood rigidly at attention, their eyes focused straight ahead as they absorbed the general's words. Around them, the crowd continued to listen with the kind of attention that came from witnessing a moment of military justice being delivered in real time. "However," General Hayes continued, "I believe this has been a learning experience that will make you better officers if you choose to learn from it. The military is built on the principle that we support and protect each other regardless of rank, age, or circumstances. Today, you forgot that principle, and Captain Stone paid the price for your oversight." The general turned to Rebecca, his expression shifting to one of respectful concern. "Captain, these officers owe you an apology, but more importantly, they owe you their commitment to never again make the mistakes they made today. Would you be willing to accept their apology?" Rebecca looked at the two young officers who had spent the morning questioning her integrity and making her the center of unwanted attention. She could see genuine remorse in their faces now, mixed with the kind of shame that came from realizing they had violated their own principles. These were not bad people. She realized they were young professionals who had made serious errors in judgment that had caused real harm. "Lieutenant Brooks," she said, her voice carrying the same steady authority that had once led soldiers through hostile territory, "what did you learn from this experience?" Brooks met her eyes for the first time since the general's arrival, and Rebecca could see that the question had forced him to confront the implications of his behavior in a way that simple punishment would not have accomplished. "Ma'am, I learned that my assumptions about people can be completely wrong, and that those assumptions can cause real harm to people who deserve better," he said. "I learned that service takes many forms, and that some of the most important service is invisible to people like me who haven't earned the right to see it." Rebecca nodded, appreciating the thoughtfulness of his response. "Lieutenant Reed, what will you do differently in the future?" Reed's answer came more slowly, but with obvious sincerity. "Ma'am, I will remember that every veteran has a story that I don't know, and that my job is to support and respect their service, not to question or verify it. I will also remember that public humiliation is never an appropriate way to address concerns about someone's behavior or credentials." "Apology accepted," Rebecca said simply. "But more importantly, I want you both to remember that leadership means protecting the people under your command and beside you in service. Today, you forgot that responsibility. Don't forget it again." General Hayes observed this exchange with the satisfaction of a senior leader watching subordinates learn important lessons about character and judgment. "Gentlemen, you will report to your commanding officers and explain what happened here today." You will also research and write reports on the challenges faced by veterans whose service involved classified operations. I expect those reports on my desk within 2 weeks. Yes, sir, both officers replied in unison. As the crowd began to disperse, General Hayes turned his attention back to Rebecca. Captain, I know this has been a difficult morning for you, but I hope you understand that what happened here today will have positive consequences that extend far beyond this commissary. Rebecca nodded, though she was still processing the emotional weight of having her story told publicly for the first time in 15 years. Sir, I appreciate everything you've done, but I never expected or wanted this kind of recognition. I know you didn't, General Hayes replied. That's part of what makes you and soldiers like you so valuable. You served without expectation of recognition, and you've carried the burden of that service in silence for 15 years. But silence has its own costs, and those costs have been too high. Colonel Walsh, who had been observing the entire exchange with professional interest, stepped forward. Sir, if I may suggest, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting. I believe Captain Stone deserves a more detailed discussion about how we can address the systemic issues that led to today's situation. General Hayes nodded. Excellent suggestion, Colonel. Captain Stone, would you be willing to join me for lunch? There are some things we need to discuss about ensuring that other veterans don't face the challenges you've encountered. Rebecca looked around the commissary, taking in the faces of the people who had witnessed her transformation from accused fraud to recognized hero. Master Sergeant Cooper gave her a respectful nod from behind the checkout counter. Staff Sergeant Santos offered a smile that conveyed both apology and respect. Even some of the civilians who had watched the confrontation seemed to regard her with newfound understanding. I would be honored, sir, Rebecca replied. As they prepared to leave the commissary, General Hayes made one final announcement to the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed here today is a reminder that the military family includes people whose service can't always be verified through conventional means. Captain Stone and her team represent the best of American military tradition: soldiers who served in silence, sacrificed without recognition, and continued to embody military values long after their official service ended. He paused, scanning the faces around him. I expect that word of today's events will spread throughout this base and beyond. When it does, I want the lesson to be clear. We support our veterans, we respect their service, and we never assume that appearances tell the whole story. The commissary erupted in spontaneous applause as General Hayes and Rebecca walked toward the exit together. For Rebecca, the sound represented something she had never expected to experience: public recognition of the service that had defined her life but remained hidden for so long. But as meaningful as the recognition was, she knew that the real work was just beginning. If her story could prevent other veterans from facing similar challenges, if it could educate young officers about the complexity of military service, if it could help bridge the gap between classified operations and public understanding, then perhaps the pain of the morning would prove to have been worth enduring. Outside in the parking lot, as she walked beside a four-star general toward a conversation that would change the rest of her life, Rebecca Stone finally allowed herself to believe that her service and the service of her fallen teammates would be remembered and honored as it deserved to be. 3 months after the commissary encounter that changed everything, Rebecca found herself standing in front of a classroom at the Army War College, facing 25 senior military officers who represented the future leadership of the United States Armed Forces. The transformation in her circumstances had been so complete that she sometimes wondered if the quiet, invisible woman who had once shopped for groceries while enduring mockery had been someone else entirely. The room was filled with colonels and lieutenant colonels, seasoned officers who had commanded units in combat and were now preparing for the highest levels of military responsibility. But as Rebecca looked out at their faces, She saw something that reminded her of the young officers who had challenged her in the commissary intelligence. Confidence, and the kind of certainty that came from years of successful military service within conventional frameworks. "Good morning," Rebecca began, her voice carrying an authority that had been rebuilt through months of speaking engagements, training sessions, and formal recognition ceremonies. "I'm Rebecca Stone, and I'm here to talk to you about operations that officially never happened, and why understanding them might save lives someday." The officers leaned forward with interest. Word of Rebecca's story had spread throughout military circles, and her transformation from forgotten veteran to respected consultant had become something of a legend within special operations communities. "How many of you have heard of Operation Desert Shield?" she asked. About half the hands in the room went up, which was more than she had expected. General Hayes had been true to his word about ensuring that her team's story received appropriate recognition within military circles. "For those who haven't," Rebecca continued, "it was a classified extraction operation in Iraq in 2008 that involved a 6-person team, tasked with evacuating 37 Americans from a compromised diplomatic facility. The operation was successful, but it cost the lives of 3 exceptional soldiers whose sacrifice prevented what could have become an international crisis." She clicked a remote, and a map appeared on the screen behind her, showing the tactical situation that Task Force Nighthawk had faced that night in the Iraqi desert. The symbols and terrain features told a story of impossible choices in split-second decisions that had determined who lived and who died. "The reason I'm here today isn't just to tell you about one successful mission," Rebecca said. "It's to help you understand the challenges faced by personnel who serve in units that operate outside conventional military structures, and to ensure that the support systems we provide for these personnel are adequate for the unique burdens they carry." Over the past 3 months, Rebecca's life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. General Hayes had been instrumental in expediting the declassification of enough operational details to allow her story to be told, while ensuring that sensitive intelligence sources and methods remained protected. Her VA benefits had been fully restored and backdated, providing financial security that allowed her to focus on more meaningful work than night security shifts. But more importantly, she had found a new purpose that honored the memory of her fallen teammates while helping to ensure that future generations of soldiers would receive better support for the unique challenges they faced. The psychological impact of classified operations extends far beyond the missions themselves, Rebecca explained to the assembled officers. When soldiers serve in units whose existence can't be acknowledged, they face isolation that begins during their service and often continues for decades afterward. She advanced to the next slide, which showed statistics about veteran suicide rates and their correlation with service in classified operations. The numbers were sobering, and she could see their impact reflected in the expressions of the officers. Listening to her presentation, 3 months ago, I was working as a night security guard and fighting a 15-year battle with VA, a bureaucracy to receive recognition for service that officially never happened, Rebecca continued. I had been living in isolation, carrying memories and wounds that I couldn't discuss with anyone, including mental health professionals who lacked the security clearances necessary to understand my experiences. Dr. Jennifer Adams, who had been Rebecca's VA psychologist for years, had become a key collaborator in developing new protocols for supporting veterans with classified service histories. Together, they had created training programs that helped mental health professionals work with patients whose experiences couldn't be fully disclosed, and support systems that provided connection and community for veterans who had been forced to carry their burdens alone. The work we're doing now focuses on 3 key areas, Rebecca explained. First, we're developing better transition programs for personnel leaving classified units, ensuring that they have access to appropriate mental health support and community connections. Second, we're creating training for VA personnel and military mental health professionals on working with veterans whose service histories involve classification issues. And third, we're establishing mentor networks that connect former special operations personnel with those currently serving in similar roles. The mention of mentor networks brought Rebecca's thoughts to one of the most meaningful aspects of her new role. She had been connected with other veterans whose service had involved similar challenges, creating a community of people who understood the unique burdens of classified operations. For the first time in 15 years, she was no longer alone. In carrying her memories and her scars, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a logistics officer who was attending the War College as preparation for promotion to general rank, raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do we identify personnel who might be struggling with these issues if their service histories are classified?" Rebecca smiled, appreciating the thoughtfulness of the question. "Excellent question, Colonel. The key is creating environments where people feel safe seeking help without fear of compromising security or facing skepticism about their experiences. We've learned that many veterans with classified service histories avoid seeking help because they've encountered situations like the one I faced in the commissary, people who question their authenticity because their experiences can't be verified through normal channels." She clicked to a slide showing the organizational structure of the new support programs that had been developed over the past few months. "We've established liaison positions within the VA system specifically for personnel with classified service histories. These liaisons have appropriate security clearances and can verify service without requiring veterans to disclose operational details." The transformation in Rebecca's own life had been remarkable. Her small apartment had been replaced by a larger place that could accommodate the materials and resources needed for her new consulting work. The walls were now decorated with photographs from training sessions and recognition ceremonies, but the centerpiece remained the same, the framed photograph of Task Force Nighthawk, the 6 soldiers who had trusted each other with their lives in the Iraqi desert. "The most important lesson I can share with you today," Rebecca told the assembled officers, "is that leadership doesn't end when someone leaves active duty. The soldiers you command today may face decades of challenges related to their service, and the support systems we create now will determine whether they receive the help they need or struggle in isolation." As the session continued, Rebecca found herself thinking about the young officers who had challenged her in the commissary. Brooks and Reed had both submitted thoughtful reports on the challenges faced by veterans with classified service histories, and both had requested opportunities to work with programs supporting such veterans. Their transformation from antagonists to advocates had been one of the unexpected positive outcomes of that difficult morning. "Your homework assignment," Rebecca announced as the session drew to a close, "is to identify veterans in your communities whose service may have involved classified operations, and to ensure they know about the support resources that are now available. Remember that these veterans may not look like what you expect a special operations soldier to look like, and they may not be able to provide the kind of verification that conventional military service generates." After the class ended, several officers approached Rebecca with specific questions about implementing support programs in their own commands. The enthusiasm and commitment they showed gave her hope that the systemic changes needed to prevent future cases like hers were not only possible but inevitable. As she packed up her materials and prepared to leave, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible veteran to respected educator. The path had been painful, but it had led to opportunities to honor her fallen teammates and help countless other veterans who had been struggling with similar challenges. Tomorrow, she would be speaking to a group of VA administrators about policy changes needed to better serve veterans with classified service histories. Next week, she had meetings scheduled with congressional staff members who were working on legislation to address the bureaucratic obstacles that had trapped her for 15 years. But tonight, she would return to her apartment and call the families of her fallen teammates Garcia, Torres, and Kim to update them on the progress being made to ensure their loved ones Sacrifices were properly recognized and remembered. Invisible service that had once isolated her had become the foundation for helping others find their way out of the shadows and into the light. 2 years after the morning that changed everything, Rebecca walked through the automatic doors of the Fort Campbell commissary with a sense of purpose that would have been unimaginable during her previous visits. She was no longer the invisible woman in a faded jacket, carefully counting dollars and avoiding eye contact. Today, she wore a crisp blazer over dress slacks, carried herself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was valued and sought after, and moved through the familiar space as a respected member of the military community. The commissary bustled with the same energy she remembered military families navigating wide aisles, retirees gathering around the coffee station, active duty personnel grabbing quick meals between duties. But something fundamental had changed in the culture of the place. A shift so subtle that only someone who remembered the old atmosphere could fully appreciate its significance. Rebecca noticed it in the way a young sergeant helped an elderly veteran reach something from a high shelf, offering assistance with genuine respect rather than grudging obligation. She saw it in the respectful nods exchanged between soldiers of different generations, and in the complete absence of the casual mockery that had once been commonplace when discussing veterans whose circumstances seemed unusual or difficult to verify. As she made her way through the store, Rebecca was recognized by several people who nodded respectfully or offered quiet greetings. Her story had become part of the institutional memory of Fort Campbell, taught in leadership courses and used as a case study in professional development programs. The woman who had once been invisible had become a symbol of the hidden service and sacrifice that sustained military communities. At the customer service counter, she encountered a familiar face. Alicia, who had been a young clerk 2 years earlier, was now a supervisor, her name tag reflecting her promotion and increased responsibilities. Her eyes lit up with recognition when she saw Rebecca approaching. "Captain Stone," Alicia said, with genuine warmth, "it's wonderful to see you. How can I help you today?" "I'm here for the orientation program," Rebecca replied. "The new protocol for working with veterans who have classification issues with their service records." Alicia nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, we've been looking forward to this training. The entire staff has been talking about how important it is to better serve veterans who face those kinds of challenges." The training program was one of many initiatives that had grown out of Rebecca's experience and the systematic changes that General Hayes had championed throughout the military community. Commissary staff, VA personnel, and military administrators now received specialized training on working with veterans whose service involved classification issues, ensuring that the bureaucratic obstacles that had trapped Rebecca for 15 years would be eliminated for future generations. As Rebecca made her way toward the conference room where the training would take place, she passed the spot where she had stood 2 years earlier, facing accusations and public humiliation from young officers who had made assumptions about her based on appearances. The memory was still painful, but it no longer carried the same weight of isolation and despair. Instead, it had become part of a larger story about transformation, education, and the importance of supporting all veterans regardless of how their service might appear to others. The conference room was filled with commissary employees, VA liaisons, and military personnel who worked with veteran services. Rebecca recognized several faces from previous training sessions, but she also saw many new people who were learning these protocols for the first time. The diversity of the group reflected the comprehensive nature of the changes that had been implemented throughout the military community. "Good morning, everyone," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the confident authority that had developed through countless speaking engagements and training sessions. "Thank you for taking the time to learn about better ways to serve veterans whose military experiences may not fit conventional patterns." Over the next 2 hours, Rebecca walked the group through case studies, policy changes, and practical techniques for working with veterans who faced verification challenges. She shared stories of other veterans who had been helped by the new protocols, and explained how small changes in approach could make enormous differences in the lives of people who had served their country in extraordinary ways. During the break, Master Sergeant Cooper approached her with a smile. He had been promoted to head of Veteran Services for the commissary, a position that had been created specifically to implement the new support protocols. "Captain, I wanted you to know that we've helped 12 veterans with classification issues since we implemented the new procedures," he said. "All of them received the services they needed without having to go through the kind of bureaucratic nightmare you experienced." Rebecca felt a deep sense of satisfaction at his words. Each veteran who received appropriate support without facing the challenges she had endured represented a small victory for the memory of her fallen teammates and the mission they had died completing. As the training session concluded, Rebecca was approached by a young woman in Army dress blues. The name tag read Lieutenant Garcia, and Rebecca's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the surname. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Sofia Garcia," the young officer said. "Corporal Anthony Garcia was my uncle." Rebecca felt her throat tighten with emotion. Anthony Garcia had been the youngest member of Task Force Nighthawk, barely 22 when he died holding a defensive position so that others could escape to safety. She had carried his memory for 15 years, but had never met any of his family members. "Your uncle was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "He died a hero, and his sacrifice saved dozens of lives." Lieutenant Garcia nodded, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "My family received your letter last year, explaining what really happened to him. It meant everything to us to finally know the truth about his service and his sacrifice." The letter had been one of the most difficult things Rebecca had ever written, but also one of the most important. With the partial declassification of Operation Desert Shield, she had been able to contact the families of her fallen teammates and provide them with details about their loved ones' final moments and the significance of their sacrifice. "I've requested assignment to Special Operations," Lieutenant Garcia continued. "I want to serve the way my uncle served, to carry on his legacy." Rebecca looked at this young officer, Anthony Garcia's niece, and saw the same dedication and courage that had characterized her uncle. "He would be very proud of you," she said simply. As the day concluded and Rebecca prepared to leave Fort Campbell, she took one final walk through the commissary. The same automatic doors that had once seemed like barriers between her hidden past and an unwelcoming world now opened onto a community that understood and valued the complexity of military service. Her phone buzzed with a text message from General Hayes, who had been promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but still maintained personal involvement in the programs they had developed together. "Rebecca, congressional hearing went well. The Veterans Classification Support Act should pass next month. Your testimony made the difference. The legislation would create permanent funding for the support programs they had pioneered, ensuring that veterans with classified service histories would have access to specialized assistance, regardless of changes in military leadership or political priorities. It represented the institutionalization of changes that had begun with a single moment of recognition in a commissary 2 years earlier. Outside in the parking lot, Rebecca stood beside her car and looked back at the building where her life had been transformed. The commissary looked exactly the same as it had 2 years earlier, but everything about its meaning had changed. It was no longer a place of humiliation and isolation, but a symbol of how individual stories could catalyze systemic change and how personal transformation could serve larger purposes. As she drove away from Fort Campbell, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible veteran to respected advocate. The path had been painful, but it had led to opportunities she could never have imagined, and changes that would benefit countless veterans for generations to come. Her apartment was no longer the sparse, lonely place it had once been. The walls were filled with photographs from ceremonies honoring her fallen teammates, letters from veterans who had been helped by the program she had developed, and awards, recognizing her contributions to military communities. But the centerpiece remained the same, the photograph of Task Force Nighthawk, 6 soldiers who had trusted each other with their lives and whose legacy now lived on in the support systems. That ensured no veteran would face their challenges alone. That evening, Rebecca opened her laptop and began working on her memoir, a book that would tell the complete story of Operation Desert Shield and its aftermath, honoring the memory of Garcia, Torres, and Kim while providing hope and guidance for veterans who faced similar struggles. The title would be simple but powerful: Service in Shadows, a soldier's journey from invisible to invaluable. The woman who had once stood alone in a commissary, defending service that couldn't be acknowledged, had become the voice for thousands of veterans whose stories deserved to be told. The shadows that had once hidden her sacrifice had been transformed into light that would guide others home. Captain Rebecca Stone, Task Force Nighthawk, Operation Desert Shield. Her service would be remembered, her teammates would be honored, and her transformation would continue to serve as proof that even the most invisible sacrifices could eventually find their way into the light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.